Hey everybody, this is Dan the Chess Enthusiast, and today we're taking a look at the final variation of the Alekhine Defense, which is the modern variation. Now, the modern variation is considered to be the best variation for white to choose out of the three, the four pawns, the exchange, and the modern, because it's very sharp for white, and it gives black a lot of opportunities to mess up in the opening, make a misstep or a miscalculation, and if white knows what it's doing, then it can very quickly swing the initiative over to its side. So it opens up with obviously pawn d4. We get into the Alekhine opening, the Alekhine defense from black. And in this position, white is going to play pawn to d4, and black's going to respond with pawn to d6. Now, you'll notice that in this position, it's actually very flexible for white. If white wants to, it can push the pawn here to c4, and then either go into the exchange variation or push the pawn to f4, which would be the four pawns variation. But the main line for the modern variation is actually simply knight to f3. And what white is looking to do in the modern variation is to completely develop on the king side before it starts to expand on the queen side. So from here, black mostly has two responses. One of them, and the best one I think, is an immediate bishop down to g4. However, I should say that there is a fianchettoed variation of the modern variation of the Alekhine's defense. However, I'll show you what it looks like, and I think you'll agree with me after I'm done showing it to you that it's pretty inferior to anything else that black can play in the modern variation. I think it really weakens the position for black and just creates too many weaknesses. Let me just show you very quickly what that looks like. So from here on move 4, black can push the pawn to g6 to get ready to fianchetto. White can play the bishop out to c4, which is attacking the knight. The knight can jump back to b6, attacking the bishop, and the bishop can fall back to b3, where you'll notice it's still putting pressure on the pawn here on f7. Black can fianchetto the bishop onto g7, but then white can play the knight out to g5, which is getting even more pressure on the f7 pawn. To try to dampen that attack, black can play pawn to e6, but then the queen can come out to f3, and again we have pressure on the f7 pawn. From here, black can develop the queen, and it's very important that black develop the queen to e7. If black develops the queen to d7, well, what that invites is white to play immediately knight to e4, and then no matter if black castles or not, black can either develop the knight here to c6 or it can castle. But after the knight plays to f6, it's checking the king and it's also attacking the queen, and that basically forces black to exchange off the dark square bishop. And this position is very dangerous for black because without the dark square bishop, the squares here on f6, h6, g7, and h8 are very weak. This queen is very deep in the position and close to the black king. White still has its dark square bishop, and the bishop playing to h6 is going to be a really big problem for black. And there's no real convenient way to chase this queen away. That's why in this position it's very important for black to develop the queen to e7 as opposed to d7. From here, both sides can castle, and then white can swing the queen over to h3, which is getting pressure on h7 and is actually threatening checkmate. From here, black can play pawn to h6, which is kicking the knight back to f3, and this is actually the end of the fianchettoed variation, the main lines that I could find. And I think you'll agree here that this is just not a really good position for black. Black is very hemmed in. The only other piece that it can develop really conveniently at the moment is this knight out to c6. The bishop here on c8 for the moment can only play to d7, whereas this white has really almost finished its development. If white wanted to, it could take this pawn here on h6, and after the exchange of the bishops, the queen can get onto h6, and that's going to be really dangerous for black. Also, it can develop the knight very easily and then swing the rooks over to the d and e file and start laying into those files. This is a very active position for white, and really not, I think, a very good position for black. That's why I think if we go back here to move 4 in the modern variation of the Alekhine, it's really just better for black to play bishop down to g4. From here, white can develop the bishop to e2, and the best move here is for black to develop its knight to c6. One thing that you might see from black is an exchange of pawns here on e5. However, I feel like that's not really that great of a move, because after the knight captures the pawn on e5 and the exchange of bishops happens on e2, black can jump its knight back to b6, white can castle. It's very important here that black not get greedy for material and take the pawn here on d4, even though it is undefended, because after rook over to d1, black's queen is in a lot of trouble. It's going to give up a lot of tempos to try to find safety. It's going to be very susceptible to attacks, and this is just going to be bad news for black. That's why instead, after white castles, it's best for black to develop its knight from b8 to d7. White can swing the rook over to e1, backing up the queen. And then after the exchange of knights on e5, you'll notice that black is lagging in development. This pawn here on e5 is already in black's territory, and black has very firm control of the e-file. It's going to be able to develop the rest of its pieces very quickly, the knight out to c3 and the bishop along this diagonal. The king's already castled, whereas black is going to have to expend a couple of moves to castle either on the king side or the queen side. This is, I feel, also just not a very good position for black. That's why if we go back here, after bishop to e2, it's best for black simply to continue with its development and play knight out to c6. From here, white can castle, and again, black has to be careful. If black now tries to fianchetto its bishop and play something like the pawn to g6, white is going to be able to grab the initiative very, very quickly here with pawn to e6. This pawn has to be taken with the f-pawn, and after it is, the knight can play to g5. The bishops can be exchanged on e2, and if black wants to, black can take the pawn on d4 to even up the material, but after the queen plays to d3, black is in a bit of a knot, because this knight here on d4 is undefended. The knight is currently the sole defender of the pawn here on e6, which is under attack from the white knight on g5. And the pawn on e6 is the sole defender of this knight here on d5. Black can try to play something natural looking like pawn to c5, but after you have pawn to c3, the knight has to fall back to c6, and black is going to go down a little bit of material here. The knight is going to be able to jump in on e6 and attack the queen. The queen can play maybe to d7, but then there goes the black knight that was sitting on d5. And black is down 2 pawns of material in this position. So that's why if facing this position, which is move 6 in the main lines, it's better for for black to play its own pawn to e6, which prevents white from playing its pawn to e6 and creating that very messy position that we just saw. From here, white can play the pawn to c4. You'll remember that I said that in the modern variation, white wants to completely develop on the king side before starting to expand on the queen side, and that's what's happened here. Black can play the knight back to b6, and then you can have an exchange of pawns on d6, and then an exchange of pawns on d5. From here, black can capture the knight that was sitting on f3, and white has 2 options. White can either capture with its bishop, or capture with the pawn on that was sitting on g2. Capturing with the bishop keeps the castle position for white very, very tight. However, after you have knight to e5, black gets a tempo when white pulls the pulls the bishop back to e2. Alternatively, if we look at the pawn recapturing here from the g-file, after the knight plays to e5, you'll notice that yes, white has opened up its castle position, but white doesn't have to give up a tempo to save this bishop, and actually this bishop is in a prime position to hit a check here on b5. Now, I'm not going to go beyond this point because that gets a bit into the middle game, and after the bishop plays to b5, it really depends how black chooses to respond, which knight it chooses to block with, all that kind of stuff. And as I said, that's getting into the middle game. However, I will say that from what I was able to find, it's actually going to be a bit difficult for black to exploit this weakness in the castle position, because if white plays properly, white's going to be able to hit the black king with a lot of attacks, and black is going to be on the defensive for most of the game here. So that is the end of the modern variation of the Alekhine's Defense that I was able to find. And I really hope you guys enjoyed the videos on these 3 variations of the Alekhine's Defense. I myself have been interested in the Alekhines for quite a while now, and I'm really happy that I was finally able to sit down and really study the opening in depth. You know, I think it's a pretty good defense. I've been playing it myself in my own games, and I've been winning and losing, but mostly I've been learning, which is obviously the point of me making these videos and sharing them with everybody. So if you have any questions or comments, certainly leave those for me and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, again, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the videos, and take care. Bye.